but when he discovered what was inside, his peaceful life collapsed in an instant. Subscribe to the channel and comment which country you're watching from. The sun had barely begun to rise when Jerome Carter pushed open the creaking screen door and stepped out into the quiet chill of dawn. The air smelled of dust and earth, the kind of scent that clung to a man who had spent his whole life working the soil. The wooden boards of the porch beneath his boots were worn smooth by years of footsteps, those of his father and grandfather before him. Beyond the porch stretched the land that had defined the Carter family for generations. Fields that seemed endless when he was a child now looked smaller each year, shrinking not from size but from the weight that pressed upon them. Drought, debt, and disappointment had a way of turning acres into inches. Jerome rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the roughness of his beard. Another night with little sleep. The same worries had twisted through his mind, winding around every thought like creeping vines choking the life from a tree. Bills overdue, notices from the bank, machinery that sputtered and coughed more than it worked. He felt trapped between memories of better times and the harsh truth that those days were gone. Still, he could not walk away, not when this land was everything. His gaze drifted toward the edges of the property, where fences, once straight and strong, now sagged like tired old bones. Beyond them lay a vast patch of barren earth, dry and unused for so long that even weeds struggled to survive. As a boy, Jerome had asked why they never planted there. His father had only shaken his head and said the soil was too stubborn, too rocky. Better to pour effort into the fertile fields close to home. But stubborn soil was still soil, Jerome thought now, and he was running out of ground. He walked toward the barn, the boards faded and red paint peeling away like flakes of old memory. Inside, his tractor waited, older than he cared to admit. He ran a hand along its dented side as though apologizing to a trusted friend he was about to push too hard yet again. He checked the oil, tightened a few loose bolts, and kicked a tire to test its resilience, though resilience was something he knew could not be measured by sound or pressure alone. The farm had always been a battle. His father, Samuel Carter, had spent his life fighting for every crop, every harvest. Jerome admired that determination. But where his father's fight seemed grounded in unwavering hope, Jerome's battle now felt like a last stand. When the rains failed, when buyers refused to pay a fair price, when the bank threatened foreclosure again and again, hope had begun to feel like a luxury he could no longer afford. Yet he remained, clinging to the vow he made as a young man holding his father's hand while the old man lay dying. The hospital room had smelled of disinfectant and wilted flowers. Machines hummed with artificial life while Samuel Carter's breaths grew shallow and frail. "Promise me," his father whispered, voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Don't let them take this land. It's your home, our legacy." Jerome had squeezed his father's hand and promised with a certainty he wished he still possessed. He could still feel the warmth of that hand, still hear the fading strength in that voice. He hadn't cried then. There hadn't been time for tears. There was too much work to do. And since that day, Jerome had carried the weight of that promise like a stone lodged permanently beneath his ribs. He climbed onto the tractor and turned the key. The engine growled, coughed, and then roared to life, sending vibrations through his bones. He guided it out toward the distant field, the forgotten field that his father had deemed too difficult, too time-consuming. Jerome no longer had the luxury of avoiding difficulties. Every unturned inch of this land was a chance at survival. The sky fully brightened now, gold washing across the slopes and hollows of the property. Birds flitted low over the tractor, following in the hopes of easy meals stirred from the dirt. The steady rumble of the machine was almost comforting, drowning out thoughts he wished would stay buried. He reached the neglected stretch of earth and lowered the plow into the ground. The tractor strained as metal met resistance. Jerome gritted his teeth and forced it forward, inch by stubborn inch. The soil here was harder, packed tight as though guarding secrets beneath the surface. Each row he carved left him sweating, muscles burning, but he felt a grim satisfaction in watching the land yield to his effort. Hope was a fragile thing, but a plowed field, no matter how small, looked like possibility. As the hours passed, memories drifted through him like ghosts. His father teaching him how to plant the first seeds of the season, his mother calling them in for supper, laughter floating from the kitchen windows. The way the house had felt full then, full of noise, full of life. Now silence dominated, walls holding only the hollow echo of what once was. He shook the thoughts away and kept working. Somewhere between the 10th and 12th pass of the plow, the tractor lurched violently. Jerome's hands clenched the wheel as the machine bucked over something hidden beneath the furrowed earth. He cut the engine, the abrupt silence ringing in his ears. Dust hung in the air, glittering briefly before settling back into the soil. He climbed down and inspected the ground. A corner of metal glinted faintly, half buried. Probably just another rusted tool or scrap left to rot decades ago, he thought. This land had a way of swallowing anything that wasn't nailed down. He knelt, brushed aside clumps of dirt, and caught sight of something. Straight edges, reinforced corners, the suggestion of a handle. A box? No, bigger than a toolbox. It was something sealed, deliberate. A ripple of unease slid through him. This place had been ignored for years, untouched by anyone but the wind and weather. How long had this metal object slept under the weight of forgotten soil? Who put it there? Why? Jerome stood up slowly, wiping his palms on his jeans. The wind had stilled, and even the birds seemed to watch in anticipation. The tractor's ticking engine faded as it cooled, leaving a strange, expectant quiet. He stared at the exposed fragment, heart thudding with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would come back with proper tools, dig it out fully, and see what secrets the stubborn land had chosen to reveal. But, as he climbed back on the tractor, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had tugged at the edge of something much larger than an old piece of metal. Something that had waited beneath the earth for a very long time. Something that might change everything he thought he knew about his family's land. And as he drove back toward the house, the promise he once made to his father weighed heavier with every turn of the wheels. For the first time in years, Jerome felt a shift, small but undeniable. The earth was giving up its silence. And whatever it had buried, he was about to uncover. Jerome barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the glint of that hidden metal flashed in the darkness behind his eyelids. He tossed and turned, the old bed springs creaking in protest beneath his weight. Outside, coyotes howled in the distance, answering one another across the open land, and the sound only fed the restless unease rising inside him. The farm seemed unusually alive, as if the very soil anticipated what tomorrow would bring. When the first hints of dawn colored the windows, Jerome forced himself out of bed. He drank a cup of stale coffee in silence, staring out over the fields that were now stained gold by the awakening sun. His gaze instinctively found the far edge of the land, where he had left his tractor and uncovered that mysterious fragment. Something waited there. something that wanted to be found. He grabbed his gloves and a shovel, tools worn smooth from countless uses. The morning air was cool as he stepped outside, but sweat threatened already, fueled not by heat but a prickling anticipation. Each step toward the distant field heightened his heartbeat. He tried to focus on the routine of walking, the crunch of dirt beneath his boots, the sway of grass brushing against his legs, but his thoughts raced ahead of him. What could it be? Some old farm equipment, long forgotten. A buried storage box, something of his father's, of his grandfather's. But deep down, Jerome knew that neither of them would have left such a thing hidden without a word. The Carters were simple men, and their secrets had always lived above ground, carved into the wrinkles of their hands and the sunburnt lines on their faces. He reached the site faster than he expected. The earth was disturbed, loose and soft where he had dug the day before. The corner of metal still protruded, catching the same early light as before, though now it seemed to shine with greater significance. Jerome rested his hand on his knee, staring at it for a long moment, then exhaled and set to work. The shovel bit into the ground with a dull thud. He dug around the object, peeling away layers of stubborn earth. The soil clung to the metal as if unwilling to surrender its captive. With each scoop, more of the shape revealed itself, a rectangular outline, corners reinforced with rusted brackets, traces of what appeared to have once been leather wrapping. There was no mistaking it now. This was no toolbox, it was a briefcase, heavy, weathered, hidden with purpose. Jerome paused and wiped his arm across his brow. A strange tension built in his chest, one that tightened with every inch unburied. He dug deeper, until at last the briefcase broke free from the clutching ground with a reluctant groan. Dirt crumbled off its sides like decades-old dust. He lifted it with both hands, surprised by its weight. Something substantial lay inside. For a moment, he simply stood there, the fields stretching silently around him. The briefcase felt cold even through his gloves. He imagined 1,000 possibilities: money from a thief long dead, tools from a forgotten worker, documents of a past owner. But no matter how he tried to rationalize it, his mind kept veering into darker assumptions. Sweeping his gaze across the quiet horizon, he felt exposed, vulnerable, alone. Carrying the briefcase to the tractor required effort, and by the time he set it on the flatbed, he was breathing hard. He looked around again, half expecting someone or something to emerge from the tree line, but the land remained as still as ever, indifferent to his discovery. The only sounds were the distant hum of cicadas and the low grumble of a storm forming far beyond his property. He climbed back into the tractor and turned the key. As he drove toward the barn, he kept glancing over his shoulder at the briefcase. That cold rectangle of mystery seemed to distort the familiarity of his land, turning everything foreign and foreboding. Inside the barn, the air smelled of oil and hay. Shafts of sunlight pierced the dusty air, illuminating floating motes that danced like restless spirits. Jerome laid the briefcase on the work table and brushed more dirt from its surface. The old lock at the front was stiff, corroded. It would not yield easily. He searched the barn for tools that might help: wrenches, crowbars, screwdrivers, anything to pry it open. Finally, he chose a sturdy chisel and an aging hammer. The first blow echoed sharply through the barn, startling a pigeon from the rafters. The second blow loosened the weathered latch. The third forced the corrupted metal to snap with a crack and shriek. Jerome hesitated. One final movement was all that stood between him and the truth sealed inside. He slid a trembling hand beneath the lid and slowly lifted it. The smell hit him immediately. Stale, metallic, a scent preserved by time. Inside, carefully arranged, were bundles of paper. Stacks of government-printed bonds, crisp despite their years, tied together with faded twine. On top lay a thick folder stamped with markings he recognized. United States military insignias, names and numbers, official seals. He thumbed through the papers with caution, each line of typed text breathing secrets never meant for unknowing eyes. Underneath the documents sat a worn envelope, edges curled. He opened it, and black and white photographs slid into his hands. He studied the first one and felt his breath hitch in his throat. There, among a group of young soldiers in uniform, was his father. Samuel Carter stood tall in the center of the picture, his stern gaze staring straight into the lens, as if aware that one day his son might look upon this very moment and wonder what truth lay behind those eyes. Other men surrounded him, some smiling, some expressionless, but all dressed in military gear, their boots firmly planted in the dirt of what appeared to be a secret or remote base. The background revealed little, just shadows and structures half buried in darkness. Jerome's hand trembled as he lowered the picture. He sifted through the others. More soldiers, more hints of clandestine operations, and, in a few, his father's face again, always serious, always burdened. Beneath the photographs, he found pages of reports referencing a covert mission, funds allocated for classified purposes, the suspicion of internal theft. There were signatures, code names, scattered notes that seemed to accuse and defend at once. Jerome stared at the folder, pieces of a puzzle forming jagged shapes in his mind. Had his father stolen this money, or had he taken it from those who did? Why had he buried this briefcase here, on the very land he swore Jerome must protect? What truths had he taken to his grave? He closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. He remembered Samuel as a quiet man, weathered not just by sun and soil, but by something unspoken that lived behind his gaze. There had always been a distance in him, moments where his eyes would drift into memories he refused to share. Now those memories lay on this table, exposed and unforgiven. Jerome was still processing this discovery when the floor beneath him trembled slightly. The barn walls seemed to absorb a new vibration, one that grew louder, more distinct. The sound of engines, vehicles, more than one. His head snapped up, heart hammering in dread. He rushed to the barn door and peered through a crack. A column of black SUVs crept up the dirt road leading to his farm. Tinted windows, aggressive posture. Men who did not come to buy produce or ask for help baling hay. He hurried back to the work table and slammed the briefcase shut without closing the latch. He scanned the room for a secure hiding place. His mind raced. They couldn't be here for anything else. Someone knew. Someone had been waiting for that buried secret to resurface. And now it had. With hurried hands, he shoved the briefcase behind a stack of wooden crates filled with old tractor parts. He piled tools on top, hoping the dust and clutter would disguise any disturbance. The engines silenced outside, doors slammed, voices carried, commanding and coarse. Jerome wiped his palms on his pants, forcing himself to breathe. He had found answers buried in the earth today, but he had also unearthed danger old as war and dark as betrayal. And whoever those men were on his land now, they were not the type to knock and ask politely about what he had uncovered. He knew, with the certainty of a man staring into the storm, that nothing in his life would ever be simple again. Jerome stood frozen in place. His breath caught halfway in his throat as the deep rumble of engines faded into an unsettling stillness. His barn, usually a refuge from the hardship of the fields, now felt like a trap. 4 walls holding him hostage with the secrets he had just uncovered. He forced himself to move, pacing silently toward the nearest window to glimpse who had arrived uninvited. Dust billowed around the boots of several men as they stepped out of their black vehicles. They walked with a firmness that spoke of authority, not the lawful kind that came with uniforms, but the kind that had been earned through intimidation and violence. They scanned the property like predators searching for weaknesses. Jerome's pulse hammered in his ears. His hands tightened into fists without him realizing. The photographs of his father were still clutched between his fingers, edges bending beneath his grip. He glanced down and saw his father's face staring back at him, unwavering and burdened. In those black and white eyes he saw an echo of the fear now twisting inside him. What had Samuel Carter been caught up in? And why had the past finally come calling? He shoved the photographs back into the envelope and carefully slid it beneath the briefcase behind the crates. The men were getting closer, their voices suddenly clear, short, clipped commands shared between them. Jerome recognized the tone. These weren't curious bystanders or friendly neighbors. They were men on a mission, and their mission started with him. He wiped the sweat from his brow and tried to calm the thundering panic in his chest. Whoever they were, they could not know that he had already opened the briefcase and read what was inside. If they suspected that his knowledge now threatened them, their response would not be polite conversation. He inhaled deeply, forcing a slow, steadying breath, and walked toward the barn door just as heavy knuckles slammed against it. When he opened it, 3 men stood in a neat line, looking like they belonged in another world entirely. Their jackets were clean and crisp, their hair trimmed with military precision. The one in front, a tall man with deep-set eyes and a jaw carved from stone, stared at Jerome as if measuring whether he was worth speaking to. "Morning," Jerome said, though his voice sounded rough and strained in his own ears. The leader's eyes flicked past him to the dim interior of the barn, scanning rapidly, noting every shadow, every tool, every lingering speck of dust. "We're looking for something," the man said. His voice was low, smooth, unused to asking permission. "Something that was lost a long time ago. You work in this land a while?" Jerome swallowed. The floor beneath his feet seemed unsteady. "All my life," he answered. "Then you know this property well." The man stepped closer, invading the space Jerome had instinctively tried to guard. "You must have seen all kinds of things come up over the years, items buried and forgotten." Jerome kept his expression as blank as he could, though his knuckles were white from how tightly he held the doorframe for support. "Just rocks. Old metal. Nothing special." The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I hope you're a better liar than that," he murmured. Jerome's stomach dropped. The other men fanned out without being told, peering into windows, circling the barn. Their polished boots crunched through gravel and hay as if they owned the ground they walked upon. "What exactly are you looking for?" Jerome forced his voice to remain steady, though he felt like a blade suspended above the edge of a fall. "A briefcase," the leader replied. He watched Jerome's face closely, hungry for reaction. "It was left here a long time ago, lost by a friend of yours, Samuel Carter." He let the name hang in the air like a threat. "Ring any bells?" Jerome felt his heart turn cold. The use of his father's name was not accidental. These men knew exactly where they were and why they had come. They knew that Samuel had buried something on this land, and now they assumed that Jerome knew too. "My father didn't have any friends who drove cars like those," Jerome said quietly. The man's jaw clenched once, a tiny twitch, but enough to tell Jerome his answer was not appreciated. Listen carefully. The leader leaned in until Jerome could see the faint scar slicing along his cheek, a reminder that this man had been through more than boardrooms and casual threats. We need that briefcase. We don't care how you found it or whether you know what's inside. But if you interfere, his voice dropped to a growl carrying a cold promise, then this land will be the least of your concerns. Jerome's throat tightened. He glanced toward the fields where his father had labored under the sun every day of his life. He could almost see the old man's ghost standing there, watching, waiting to see whether his son would bend under pressure. "I don't know what you think is out here," Jerome said, with all the courage he could gather, "but there's nothing for you on this farm." The leader stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. He stepped back, motioning for his men to leave the barn. "We'll be back," he said, and Jerome believed him without question. "I suggest you think carefully about what's important to you before that happens." The men returned to their SUVs, engines roaring to life once more. They didn't rush. They left slowly, deliberately, letting thick clouds of dust billow in their wake. The message was clear. They controlled the timing. They controlled the next move. And Jerome was now trapped in whatever game they intended to play. When the vehicles vanished down the road, Jerome's legs finally gave way. He stumbled to a stool and lowered himself before he fell outright. His breath shuddered in and out, hands trembling uncontrollably. He stared at the crates hiding the briefcase as if expecting the secrets inside to crawl out and reveal themselves. Inside those metal walls lay answers about his father, about this mission, about the men who had just threatened him. Answers wrapped in mystery and danger, now tied irrevocably to his fate. He stood again and reached for the briefcase. His fingers touched the cold metal with a reverence mixed with fear. He dragged it back onto the workbench and reopened it, staring once more at the documents that had already begun to warp the entire shape of his life. He picked up the topmost page, reading each word slowly. Funds allocated under secrecy. Military personnel assigned to transport. A timeline of events that led to those funds disappearing along with several soldiers. Among the signatures was his father's, not forged, not incidental. Samuel Carter had been involved deeply, either willingly or under orders. But what role had he played? Was he betrayed by his brothers in arms, or had he become one of them? Jerome's mind flashed back to childhood scenes. Times when his father would sit by the fire, staring into the flames long after the rest of the family had gone to bed. Times when quick noises made him flinch or reach for something at his waist, where no weapon rested anymore. Times when stories of the military brought a sudden storm into his eyes. A good man burdened by something too terrible to speak aloud. Jerome brushed a trembling thumb over his father's face in the photograph. "What did you do?" he whispered. The silence answered him with a palpable tension. Then came the fear. The realization that he was now part of something he had never asked for, something violent and ruthless. He was no longer just a farmer struggling to save his land. He was a witness. A connection to secrets buried by men who would kill to protect them. He remembered the leader's final words, "We'll be back." His father had tried to bury his sins or his heroism beneath the soil, but the past never stayed buried forever. Now it was up to Jerome to decide whether he would follow the same path or bring truth to the surface, no matter the consequences. He slid the documents back into the briefcase and latched it shut. His fingers hovered over the handle, knowing that he needed to move it, hide it better, protect it. At the same time, he knew that this briefcase was no longer just evidence of his father's hidden life. It was leverage. It was danger. It was a key that opened doors to justice, or destruction. The barn suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Anyone could return, kick down the doors, and take what they wanted. Jerome clutched the handle and carried the briefcase to the house, moving quickly as if shadows were reaching out to grasp him. Inside, he pushed the kitchen table aside and pried up a floorboard the way his father had shown him long ago. A stash point for emergency money, protected from storms and prying hands. Now it would become the hiding place of secrets worth more than anything Jerome had ever owned. He lowered the briefcase gently into the hollow darkness beneath the floor. Before replacing the board, he paused and looked into the darkness at the sealed vessel of truth. What he had found was a burden, heavy enough to crack the life he had known. His father had carried this burden in silence for decades, alone. Now, Jerome carried it too. Wherever those men had come from, whatever they wanted, whatever they were willing to do, the battle lines had formed. His land was no longer just his family's inheritance. It had become a battlefield. He slid the floorboard back into place and stood, staring at his home, his barn, his fields. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. The shadows of the past had finally surfaced, and Jerome knew that soon they would demand the full truth. And what he chose next would determine whether his father's legacy would be remembered with honor or erased by violence and fear. The storm was not coming. It was already here. The hours following the departure of the strangers stretched like a taut wire ready to snap at the slightest movement. Jerome paced through the house, unable to settle, unable even to sit. Every creak of the old wooden floorboards sounded like footsteps returning. Every shift in the wind outside felt like a warning. He should have felt safer inside his own home, but instead the walls pressed inward, suffocating him with the weight of what he knew. The briefcase hidden beneath the floorboards seemed to radiate a feverish presence, as if the secrets locked inside were too powerful to be contained. He tried to work, but every chore he attempted fell apart beneath trembling hands. The tractor sat idle in the yard, streaks of dried mud clinging like scars where the earth had resisted giving up its secret. Jerome stared at the distant field from the kitchen window, remembering how innocent the morning had been before metal emerged from the ground to rewrite everything he believed about his father, and about the land he had vowed to protect. That oath now felt heavier, more complex. Protecting the land suddenly meant surviving forces far greater than drought or debt. His stomach churned with unease as the afternoon passed. More than once he found himself glancing toward the road, expecting to see dust rising from tires. But the horizon remained empty, deceptively calm. The stillness began to feel like a trap, as though the men had retreated only far enough to watch unseen. The uncertainty was its own kind of torment, fraying his nerves until a knock on the door would have been preferable to the silence. Toward evening, he heated a pot of beans, but the smell turned his stomach. He tried to swallow a few spoonfuls, chewing mechanically, his appetite lost somewhere between fear and exhaustion. He set the bowl aside and pressed his palms against the kitchen counter, head bowed. He needed help. He couldn't face men like those alone. The sheriff was a logical choice. Law enforcement, the voice of authority, sworn to protect citizens. But Jerome's gut twisted at the thought. Something about those strangers had felt deeply connected to power, the wrong kind of power. If they were truly dangerous, what guarantee did he have that the sheriff wouldn't already be under their influence? Still, he couldn't ignore the fact that they had spoken his father's name as though they knew it intimately. They knew about the land. They had been searching for the briefcase for a very long time. That meant someone in this region must have known about them, known about the money, known about Samuel Carter. If the sheriff wasn't aligned with them, perhaps he knew someone who was, and then Jerome could at least learn the truth. As night crept over the farm, thick with crickets and the distant calls of night birds, Jerome retreated to his bedroom but could not rest. He lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling while shadows flickered like ghosts of memories he had never been told. He remembered his father once warning him that not everything buried should be dug up. At the time, Jerome assumed it was just a lesson about farming, about letting the land decide what it was willing to reveal. Now, those words echoed with eerie precision, as though Samuel had been speaking about this exact moment. Sleep finally found him just before dawn, but it was shallow and filled with jagged dreams, SUVs prowling like wolves, photographs of soldiers crumbling to ash, his father's voice calling from beneath the earth. He jolted awake, heart pounding as sunlight poured into the room. He wiped the sweat from his brow and forced himself to rise. Today he would find answers. He had no choice. After securing the house and checking twice that the briefcase remained safe beneath the floor, Jerome climbed into his truck. The engine coughed before rumbling reluctantly to life. He drove down the dirt road, dust swirling behind him like a trail leading his enemies straight to him. As the town neared, he rehearsed what he would say, how much he would reveal. He didn't trust easily, not anymore, but he needed to believe that someone might still be on the side of the law. The county sheriff's office sat just off the main street, its squat brick structure flanked by 2 patrol cars. A flag swayed lazily in the morning breeze, and the windows reflected the bright light of a new day that felt too ordinary for the crisis tightening around Jerome's life. He parked and took a moment to steady himself before stepping inside. The air smelled like burnt coffee and paper. A radio crackled from somewhere out of sight. At the reception desk, a deputy looked up with a stiff nod. "Sheriff's inside," he said without Jerome uttering a word. That unease in his gut twisted tighter. When the sheriff stepped out of his office, Jerome saw the recognition and surprise flash briefly in his eyes. Sheriff Daniels was a square-shouldered man with a thick mustache and a voice that usually carried too much confidence for Jerome's liking. But today, that voice sounded cautious. "Carter," he greeted, folding his arms. "I haven't seen you in a while. Something wrong on the farm?" Jerome didn't waste time. "Some men came out to the property yesterday," he said, measuring the sheriff's reaction. "They were looking for something buried. Said they knew my father." Sheriff Daniels' brows lifted slightly. "That so?" His tone was neutral, but a flicker of intrigue passed through his eyes. "Did they say who they were with? Military? Government?" "No," Jerome replied, and they weren't too keen on explaining themselves. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Did they threaten you?" The image of the leader leaning in, voice sharp enough to cut bone, flashed vivid as the barn itself. "They strongly implied that if I found anything, I should hand it over." The sheriff glanced back toward his office, as though contemplating information buried deeper than he wanted to reveal. "Men like that don't just show up without reason," he said finally. "Where'd they say they were from?" "They didn't," Jerome replied, "but they mentioned something buried a long time ago, something that belonged to my father." There it was, a brief, barely perceptible shift of the sheriff's posture. Jerome caught it. A hesitation and a fear. "You didn't find anything, did you?" Daniels asked, the question too bold, too direct. Jerome stiffened. "What makes you think I did?" The sheriff didn't blink. "Because they wouldn't come otherwise." It was then Jerome realized the sheriff knew far more than he would admit. And in that realization, dread congealed inside his chest. He had walked into a place he hoped would offer protection, only to find more shadows lurking behind badges and uniforms. The sheriff sighed, rubbing a calloused hand across his mouth. "Look, Carter, there are people out there, powerful people, who don't like unfinished business. If your father was mixed up in something, it's best you stay out of it. Let them take whatever they're looking for and you'll be left alone." The betrayal hit hard enough to stagger him. "You expect me to trust them? After what they said?" The sheriff's voice hardened. "I expect you to trust me when I tell you that you don't want to get involved." Their eyes locked. Jerome felt the ground beneath him shifting, losing its stability. He thought of his father's trembling hand gripping his, that final promise whispered on a dying breath. "Don't let them take this land." He understood now that Samuel hadn't been referring to the bank or the storms. He had meant these men, these wolves disguised as officials and patriots. Jerome turned to leave without another word. He could not count on the sheriff. He could not count on anyone but himself. The drive back felt far longer than the journey into town. Trees leaned like silent spectators as he passed, their branches seeming to point condemning fingers. His truck rattled over ruts in the road, but he barely noticed. He was too consumed by the crushing knowledge that he stood alone against enemies powerful enough to alter the truth itself. As he neared the farmhouse, his breath caught. Tire tracks, fresh ones, cut deep into the dirt near the barn. Tracks that had not been there when he left. He slammed the truck into park and leapt out, heart pounding like hooves against the earth. The barn door hung slightly ajar. Jerome rushed inside, every instinct braced for confrontation. The interior was a mess. Tools scattered, crates overturned, hay trampled into the dust. They had searched. They had torn through every corner of his sanctuary. But had they looked inside the house? He sprinted for the porch, stumbling on the steps as fear clawed through his chest. He shoved the door open, scanning the living room, the kitchen, the hall. Furniture was disturbed, drawers open, cupboards rifled through. They had been here. They were looking. But the floorboard still lay just as he left it. He dropped to his knees and pried it up. The breath he'd been holding finally released when he saw the briefcase still resting in the hollow darkness. They hadn't found it. Yet. He set the board back and sat with his back against the cabinet, chest heaving. The men had returned already, just as they promised, and next time they might not leave without what they wanted, or without him. Outside, a hawk screamed, the sound slicing through the quiet like a warning. Jerome stared at the wall in front of him. The truth would not disappear. The wolves would return. And if he did nothing, if he continued to hide and hope, the past would consume him the same way it had consumed his father. His only chance was to find the truth first, to bring light into the darkness before the darkness swallowed him whole. And now he knew, with chilling clarity, that the danger was escalating. The time for fear was over. He would have to fight for the land, for his father's name, and for his own survival. Because the wolves were coming back, and next time they would not knock. Jerome remained seated on the floor for a long time, unable to move, unable to think beyond the pounding of his own heartbeat. The house smelled faintly of overturned dust and the sweat of intruders whose presence lingered like a stain in the air. He felt violated, exposed, as though strangers had pried into the very core of his life and judged it worthless unless it contained what they wanted. His father's legacy, once a source of pride, had become bait in a dangerous game he never agreed to play. The sun was still high when he finally pushed himself up, pacing the house with uneven steps. Closets lay open like mouths hung in silent gasps. Drawers were yanked so forcefully that one had splintered, wooden fragments scattered across the floor. They had gone through everything except the hidden board beneath the kitchen floor, his father's last line of defense. The men had been close, terrifyingly close, and the thought made Jerome's hands tremble with renewed fear. Had they found anything else? Any clue that led them to guess the secret was still there? He forced himself to check every room, searching for anything missing, anything planted. But what unsettled him most was the impression that the intruders had not left in anger. They had left confident, as though they believed he would eventually give them what they wanted, as though time itself was their ally. Jerome stumbled onto the porch and let the fresh air fill his lungs. The vast fields, once a comfort, now seemed like endless open eyes watching him. He needed a plan. The sheriff couldn't be trusted. Those men would return soon. He could not let them pin him to the walls of his own home like a cornered animal. He needed help from beyond this county, beyond his corrupt roots that ran too deep into the soil. The federal government. The idea struck him suddenly, with the clarity of sunlight cutting through storm clouds. The documents in the briefcase carried the marks of classified military property, money that belonged to the state, not criminals. If he could speak to someone above these wolves in suits, maybe the law would finally stand by his side. His hands still shaking slightly, Jerome pulled his cell phone from his pocket. He scrolled past useless apps and contacts, finding the number for the state bureau he remembered seeing once on a flyer at the feed store. His thumb hovered over the call button. Once he made this call, everything changed again. There would be no return to ignorance, no pretending he had found nothing but dirt and rust. He pressed the button. The line rang. A click, then a voice, flat and professional. Federal Bureau, State Division. How may I direct your call? Jerome steadied himself. My name is Jerome Carter, he began, forcing each word to form clearly. I need to report a crime, a major one. It involves stolen military funds hidden on private property. I have proof. The voice on the other end sharpened immediately. Another click, a different voice, older, more authoritative. Mr. Carter, I need you to start from the beginning. Jerome explained everything in painstaking detail. His discovery of the briefcase, the documents, the photographs, the strangers who had arrived with threats, the sheriff who offered only intimidation disguised as advice. The line stayed silent as he spoke, and the silence weighed heavily. When he finished, the agent exhaled slowly. Mr. Carter, the voice replied, crisp with gravity, what you've described is part of an ongoing federal investigation. You've done the right thing contacting us. Do you still have possession of the briefcase and its contents? Yes. And you have not turned over any of its contents to local law enforcement or the men who confronted you? No. A pause, then, good, listen carefully. Do not contact your sheriff again. Do not confront the men who visited your property, and do not try to move or destroy the briefcase. We will dispatch agents to your location within the next 48 hours. You are not safe until we arrive. The words struck Jerome like ice water. He gripped the phone tighter. 48 hours? I don't know if I have that long. You need to trust us, Mr. Carter, the agent insisted. Keep a low profile. Avoid contact with anyone who approaches you about this matter. We will be there soon. The call ended. The line went dead, leaving Jerome alone again with his racing thoughts. 48 hours. 2 days stand between him and salvation, or disaster. He spent the next evening in vigilance. He checked and rechecked the locks. He positioned furniture near windows where blinds had been broken. A hammer rested near his bedside. He turned off lights and sat in the darkness, watching the moonlit road with wide, sleepless eyes. Every distant sound became a threat. An owl's cry sent a jolt through his heart. A car passing miles away stirred paranoia that clawed at his nerves, and the hours dragged relentlessly. The night finally faded, replaced by a dull, gray dawn. Jerome's chest ached from tension, but adrenaline kept him upright. He forced himself to eat, although every bite felt like gravel. He needed strength. The wolves could return at any moment. By afternoon, fatigue wrapped around him like thick fog. His thoughts grew sluggish, vision blurred at the edges. Just as he closed his eyes for a moment too long, a faint crunch reached his ears, the sound of tires rolling over gravel. He lurched toward the window. 2 trucks, rusted, local, familiar, not the polished SUVs, and yet fear burned through him as 2 figures climbed out, Sheriff Daniels and a deputy. The sheriff's steps were brisk and determined as he approached the porch, gaze locked on the house like a hawk homing in on prey. Jerome swore under his breath, backing away from the door. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't prepared for a man with the power to twist justice into a weapon. The sheriff knocked, though the gesture was merely ceremonial. "Jerome," he called, "we need to talk. Now." Jerome's mind raced. The agent's warning beat like a war drum in his memory. Do not contact your sheriff again. Do not confront the men who visited your property. He remained silent. The sheriff's next knock was harder. "I know, you're in there." His voice was sharp, no longer pretending politeness. "Open the door." Jerome stood motionless, barely breathing. Footsteps shifted outside. A voice, lower, murmuring. The deputy. They were discussing something, maybe whether to force entry. The sheriff's temper cracked. "If you're hiding something, Carter, it's only a matter of time before we find it. You can't keep the truth from coming out." Jerome shuttered his eyes briefly, rage and fear clashing in his chest. The sheriff wasn't here to protect the law. He was here to protect criminals, to protect himself. He clasped his hands into fists and prayed the sheriff would leave. Slowly, eventually, footsteps retreated from the porch. The engines started. Tires scattered gravel. The trucks left a fresh scar across the road. Jerome didn't dare relax. He went straight to the kitchen floor, pried up the board again, and checked the briefcase. It was still there, intact. But the sheriff's visit confirmed what Jerome already knew. The walls of his world were closing in tighter every day. Night returned with renewed terror. No matter how vigilant he was, exhaustion gnawed away at his resolve. He forced himself to lie down, though sleep would not truly come. Dreams twisted into nightmares. Uniforms loomed above him, faceless and armed. His farm burned, fields turning black beneath smoke that choked the sky. His father's voice echoed as if from beneath the ground, urging him to stand firm. Jerome woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, and for a moment he felt like a child again, unequipped, unworthy, overwhelmed. But the farm was silent. The road was empty. His lungs eventually found rhythm. He sat up in the dim room and realized something solid had settled inside him through the fear. Resolve. His father had faced these wolves once before and refused to surrender. Jerome would not be the weak link that undid that sacrifice. 48 hours. He only needed to hold out 48 hours. He dressed, strapped on his boots, and stepped outside as the sun climbed over the horizon. The threat remained. The fear lingered. But, for the first time since digging up that cursed briefcase, Jerome felt something pushing just as strongly in the other direction. Hope. Thin as a thread, yet enough to hold. He looked toward the distant tree line where trouble would inevitably return. The land beneath his feet felt different now, not a burden, not a prison, but a promise he would not break. Because help was coming, because truth was finally rising from the soil, and because Jerome Carter would fight until the last breath to protect everything his father died to leave behind. Jerome had never known time to move so cruelly slow. Every hour felt like a day, and every minute felt like a test of will. The sun blazed overhead, yet he felt cold beneath its heat. His breath came short and shallow, as if fear itself tried to choke him from the inside. He kept glancing toward the driveway, the tree line, the road from town, any direction where danger might reappear. The promise of federal agents arriving within 48 hours gave him something to cling to, but hope and dread tangled inside him like barbed wire, tightening with each passing moment. He tried to distract himself through work. He fed the chickens, though his hands shook so badly he spilled half the feed. He checked the plumbing in the barn, though his eyes kept flicking toward the open door. He inspected his fence line, though every rustle in the brush sent him dropping into a defensive crouch like a soldier in enemy territory. The land that had always been home now felt like a battlefield, every hill a hiding place, every shadow a threat. By mid-afternoon, he walked the rows of his field simply to keep moving. The dried stalks whispered with the wind, but their voices felt ominous instead of comforting. His father's ghost seemed to lean over his shoulder with each step, urging him to stand his ground. That memory kept him from breaking, even when fear gnawed at the edges of his resolve. As the sun dipped low, painting the horizon crimson like fresh wounds, Jerome knew the wolves would appear again under that cloak of dying light. Men like them thrived in intimidation, and nothing intimidated more than a visit in the dark. The wind died to a breathless stillness. The cicadas' hum faded. The world seemed to hold itself still, waiting. When the first engine roared somewhere far down the road, Jerome's heart surged into his throat. He ran to the house and slammed the door shut, locking it, bolting it, securing it as though thin wood could stop the hungry violence coming for him. He had only a hammer and a kitchen knife for protection, weapons laughably small against firearms and trained killers, but they were something, better than bare hands and fear. The headlights carved through the darkness before he saw the vehicles themselves, 3 black SUVs rolling slow like sharks circling prey. They stopped in front of his house. Doors opened, boots crunched gravel. Men emerged with purpose and aggression, flashlights slicing through the night. They didn't knock this time. They didn't pretend courtesy. One of them signaled with 2 fingers, and the rest split apart, forming a semicircle around the house. Jerome's breath stilled in his chest. He crouched behind the living room window, watching their silhouettes creep closer. One man stepped onto the porch, his boots thudding heavily against the wood, and pounded against the door. "Carter," he barked, his voice seething with fury. "We're tired of games. Open this door." Jerome didn't move. His silence was answer enough. The man's tone hardened into something darker. "We know you made a call. We know who you talked to. They won't get here in time. You have something that belongs to us, and you're going to hand it over." A fist crashed against the door, once, twice, then again, each strike stronger, splintering the wood. Jerome backed away into the hall, clutching the hammer tightly. They wouldn't wait much longer. They would break in, seize the briefcase, and kill him to bury the evidence forever. He needed to be faster than their rage. He remembered the tunnels his father once dug for irrigation, shallow trenches that snaked through the property to drain floodwater into the lower fields. Those trenches now lay mostly forgotten beneath the tall grass and weeds. But Jerome had walked them 1,000 times as a boy. In the dark, with his eyes closed. He knew every twist and turn. There was still a way out. The back door would be watched, but beneath the pantry floor his father had built an emergency hatch years ago, a precaution for storms or wildfires. Jerome rushed to the kitchen, ignoring the violent cracking of the front door behind him. He cleared the floorboard, pulled open the latch, and lifted himself into the narrow crawl space. The air smelled of earth and old wood. He dragged the hatch closed above him just as the heavy crash of the front door being smashed open echoed through the house. Boots thundered across the floorboards, furniture was knocked over, glass shattered. They were inside. Jerome crawled forward, his breath ragged, dirt pressing into his palms. The tunnel was barely wide enough for his shoulders, but he forced his body through, inch by inch. He could hear muffled voices above him, angry, impatient, predatory. "He's still here somewhere. Find that case. Hurry, we don't have much time before—" The rest of the sentence cut off as Jerome pushed deeper into the darkness. The tunnel opened finally into the irrigation ditch behind the barn. He crawled out into the night air, gasping for breath. In the distance, the men had scattered, searching the wrong places. He looked toward the shed. There was a chance, a slim one, that he could circle around and buy himself time. His mind raced. The agents had promised help. But what if they didn't come soon enough? He needed something to level the field, a weapon, leverage, anything. His father had always said the land could fight with you, if only you knew its secrets. Jerome wasn't a soldier, he wasn't trained, but he had one advantage. This was his territory. He sprinted to the barn, hugging the shadows. The wolves had left it in disarray, but in their rage they hadn't noticed the old hunting rifle mounted high on the wall, dusty and forgotten. Jerome scrambled up and grabbed it down. The wood was dry and rough against his hands. He checked the chamber, loaded. Only a few rounds, but enough to make a stand if necessary. He heard shouting from the house. Someone had found the hatch. They were coming. The moon hung low and wide, silvering the field. Jerome moved toward the far edge of the property, where the land dropped into a dip. There, thick brush and tall grass could conceal him until backup arrived. If backup arrived. The voices grew louder behind him. Flashlights sliced through the field. They were fanning out again, spreading like a tightening net. Jerome dropped low into a shallow trench and crept through the grass, staying beneath sightlines. Every rustle felt too loud. Every heartbeat was a countdown. Then a light swept dangerously close. He froze. A man stood just yards away, scanning the field with a pistol drawn. His jaw clenched, eyes sharp as razors. The rifle felt heavy. Impossible. Jerome had never fired at a living person in his life. Could he really do it? As if answering the question, the stranger's beam landed on the dirt where Jerome had just been. The man's mouth twisted into a wicked smile as he raised his weapon. Jerome acted on instinct. He rolled to the side, shouldered the rifle, and fired once. The muzzle flash blinded him for a moment, and the recoil punched into his shoulder like a sledgehammer. A cry split the night. The man collapsed, grabbing his thigh, swearing violently. Jerome scrambled deeper into the ditch, adrenaline making his hands shake almost uncontrollably. The others shouted, lights swinging wildly. Jerome moved faster, disappearing into the shadows of the field. Once hidden, he dared to look back. He saw the wounded man crawling, clutching his gun but unable to stand. His shouts were filled with rage and disbelief. Jerome hadn't killed him, but he had stopped him. The wolves were panicking now. They hadn't expected a farmer to bite back. Far down the road, faint blue lights began to flicker in the darkness, slow at first, then gaining strength. Headlights, multiple in formation. Engines, more powerful than the SUVs. The sound grew nearer. Shouts erupted from the field, frantic and sharp. The federal agents had arrived. Black and white vehicles surged onto the property, tires ripping through dirt. Officers poured out with guns drawn, bulletproof vests gleaming in the moonlight. Orders barked, lights flashed, chaos ignited. Jerome watched as the confrontation exploded. Armed men tackled to the ground, weapons kicked away, hands zip-tied behind backs. One man tried to flee toward the woods, but was dropped by a clean shot fired into the air above his head. Another threw down his weapon before agents even reached him, palms high and shaking. It was over quicker than Jerome could process. Silence returned to the field, different from before. Not hollow and tense, but heavy with relief. The kind of silence that follows salvation. Jerome stepped from the ditch, rifle still clutched in hand. A pair of agents immediately turned their weapons toward him before another shouted, "Hold fire, that's the caller." 3 agents rushed to him. One took the rifle gently from his hands. Another steadied him by the elbow when his knees nearly buckled from exhaustion. A third, the one who had spoken to him on the phone, approached with a nod of grim respect. "You did good, Mr. Carter," the agent said. "You did very good." Jerome exhaled shakily, vision blurring as his heartbeat began to slow. His legs trembled beneath him, but relief flooded through his body like warm water thawing ice. He was safe. The agent guided him back toward the house, away from the flashing lights and captured criminals. As they walked, Jerome noticed the wounded man being lifted onto a stretcher, snarling threats through gritted teeth. One look at the agent's face told him those threats would carry no weight anymore. The wolves had been caged. Inside the house, Jerome sank into a chair at the kitchen table. His hands were still shaking as an agent poured him a glass of water. Another knelt to lift the hidden floorboard and recover the briefcase. He opened it just enough to verify the contents. His expression hardened as he looked at the classified documents, the bonds, the photographs, evidence of corruption buried deep in history. One agent sat across from Jerome. He was older, with kind but weary eyes that had seen too much. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "Jerome," he began, voice low and steady, "I need you to understand something important. Your father, he wasn't one of them." Jerome's breath caught. "He was the one who stopped them," the agent continued. "Those men attempted to steal government funds during a secret operation. Your father discovered the plot and intervened. He took the briefcase before they could complete the theft. He intended to hand it over to authorities. But they found out. There was a struggle, and the official record classified his death as an accident." Jerome stared, disbelief and sorrow blending into something indescribable. "Your father saved millions of taxpayer dollars," the agent said softly. "He risked everything to do the right thing, but he didn't make it in time." They planned to retrieve the evidence later and silence him forever. They failed, but he died before he could tell anyone the truth. Jerome bowed his head, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. All the pieces of his father's life, the haunted eyes, the unspoken memories, the weight he carried, fell into place. Samuel Carter had not been a man with secrets of shame. He had been a man with a burden of honor. "He died a hero," Jerome whispered. "Yes," the agent replied, "and you may have just saved countless others by making sure his story wasn't buried with him." The room felt strangely lighter, as if the ghost of Samuel Carter had finally been granted peace. Jerome looked up through blurred eyes and managed a quiet, exhausted smile. The land his father had fought for, had died for, was safe. And Jerome had kept his promise. For the first time in many years, the sun that rose over Carter Farm did not feel like an intruder trying to scorch life from the earth. It felt warm, welcome, almost kind. The grass shimmered with a fresh morning dew, as though the land itself exhaled in relief after a storm it had endured for far too long. The fields stood silent but strong, no longer hiding danger beneath their soil, no longer concealing the weight of secrets lost to time. Just earth and sky and the promise of growing things. Jerome stood outside with a steaming mug of coffee between his hands, watching agents load the now sealed briefcase into one of their armored trucks. The men, federal officers whose arrival had saved his life, moved with respectful purpose. They nodded to him, acknowledging the quiet strength he had shown in the face of death. He felt small under the magnitude of everything that had unfolded, yet something inside him had shifted. He carried his father's fire now, and that fire refused to be extinguished. One of the lead agents, the same man with weary eyes who had spoken to him inside the house, approached. In the gray morning light, the agent's expression looked gentler, less hardened by years of hunting men like the ones they had taken away. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a document, carefully protected inside an official folder bearing the seal of the United States government. "This is a formal statement clearing your father of any wrongdoing." His voice was steady and sincere. "It confirms he died attempting to protect national property and assist in exposing corruption. His name will be restored." Jerome accepted the document with trembling hands. He stared at the printed words: Samuel Carter, honorable service, heroic actions, legacy. A lump rose in his throat, thick and unfamiliar. Pride, real pride, not the fragile imitation he had clung to just to survive. He had always believed his father was a good man. Now the world finally knew it too. "There's more," the agent continued, and Jerome looked up, uncertain how much more his heart could handle. "Due to the role you played in assisting federal law enforcement during an active investigation, and given the danger you were placed in, compensation will be issued to you. Your debts will be cleared, and the state has agreed to grant this property a protected designation. This farm isn't going anywhere. It's yours." The words echoed like the ringing of a church bell, clear, undeniable, miraculous. Jerome tried to speak, but emotion sealed his voice shut. So instead, he simply nodded. The agent offered one more solemn handshake before turning away. As the last vehicle pulled down the dirt road, leaving behind only tire tracks and peace, Jerome let the silence rush into the space they left behind. But it wasn't the silence of fear that had suffocated him for days. It was quiet that comforted, like the soft hush of a parent soothing a child in the dark. He walked the length of the farmhouse inside and out, taking stock of the damage left behind. Furniture overturned, wood splintered, walls scuffed and cracked. And yet, somehow, everything felt easier to fix now. The threat was gone. The wolves were gone. When he reached the kitchen, he paused before the spot where the floorboard had been lifted so many times recently. He knelt, resting his hand on the wood as if thanking it for keeping his father's legacy safe for all these years. Then he stood and opened the back door to step out into the wide fields that had defined his life. The earth looked raw in the spots where danger had unfolded: boot prints, trampled grass, even a dark patch of earth where blood had spilled into the soil. His land had tasted violence to protect him, just as it had once shielded his father. The sky above was a perfect ocean of blue, streaked with thin clouds pulled like cotton. And something deep inside Jerome tugged at him, drawing him towards the far corner of the field where the earth had first revealed its secret. He found a shovel leaning against the barn, paused only a second, and then carried it with him through the high grass, his boots pressed into fresh ground that felt soft and forgiving underfoot. When he arrived at the spot, the exact place where the plow had caught that glint of metal, he stopped and breathed deeply. This land was more than inheritance. It was a grave for lies and a cradle for truth. It had hidden pain so that future seeds could one day grow without the poison of fear. And now it deserved something in return. Jerome drove the shovel into the soil. The earth parted cleanly, welcoming each turn. Sweat gathered at his temples as he dug a small, deep hole big enough to take root. When it was ready, he set the shovel down and lifted from his arms the sapling he had brought. An oak, young but sturdy, leaves fluttering with the slightest breeze. His father had always admired oaks. Strongest wood in the county, he used to say. Storm-proof, fire-resistant. The tree that lived for centuries and still stood tall. Jerome thought of that now as he lowered the oak into the ground and pressed soil gently around its base. He packed the earth with his palms, leaving a small mound like a promise. The tree stood straight and proud, a green banner declaring survival. But to Jerome, it was more than just a symbol. It was his father's monument. Not a tombstone marking where a life ended, but a living legacy marking where a life's courage had continued on. He sat back against the grass and looked at the sapling for a long time. His muscles ached, but the ache felt good, felt earned. He noticed his breathing, slow, even, patient, as though every breath aligned him more firmly with the world that had nearly slipped away. This was what peace felt like. Not the absence of danger, but the presence of truth. Days turned into weeks. Repairmen came and went, fixing the damage done to the barn and the house. The rifle was returned to its place on the wall, not as a desperate tool, but as a reminder that courage could come from even the simplest hands. The fields grew thicker and greener with each new dawn. Rain returned, as if the skies themselves had been holding back until justice was restored. The farm was healing. And so was he. Jerome worked the soil with newfound purpose. Every seed he planted felt like an offering to his father. Every harvest that sprouted felt like a victory carried forward. Neighbors began to stop by more often than they ever had before. Some had heard rumors of what had happened, though not the classified details, and their admiration was shy but genuine. "You did right," they told him. "You protected your own. You kept Carter land Carter land." Jerome accepted their words quietly. Praise was nice, but what mattered most was knowing his father would have been proud. One warm evening, as fireflies blinked alive and the first stars pierced the sky, Jerome found himself once again standing before the sapling. It had grown centimeters already, small but noticeable. He rested a hand on its thin trunk and smiled. The air smelled sweet, fresh, like the scent after a heavy rain. His father would always be here now, in the roots of this tree, in the soil that had kept his secrets safe, in every blade of grass that dared to rise. And Jerome no longer felt alone. For years, this farm had been haunted by silence, his father's silence, then his own. Now, the silence was comfortable again, a calm blanket at the end of a hard day rather than the suffocating quiet of fear. The house behind him glowed with warm light through the windows. The porch creaked in the gentle wind, but no longer sounded like bones bending beneath dread. The land hummed softly, alive and grateful. When he finally returned inside and turned off the lights, he didn't lock the door out of terror, but simply out of habit. For the first time in so long he could remember, he laid down in his bed and closed his eyes without waiting for nightmares. He did not wait for engines to roar in the darkness, or fists to hammer at his walls, or ghosts of hidden sins to emerge from the earth. He simply rested. Before sleep carried him into peace, one final thought drifted through his mind, quiet and powerful. His father had fought to protect this farm, and now Jerome would live to make it flourish. The promise he had made as a frightened son in a quiet hospital room had been kept, not through survival alone, but through courage, truth, and stubborn love for land that had never abandoned him. The Carter farm would endure. Its roots would not die, and neither would the legacy buried in its soil. If you want more shocking real-life stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. And don't forget to share this video with someone who loves a good twist. Click on the next story. You won't